up? Jack here with devslopes.com. Welcome back to our API course where we are right in the middle of building an iOS client application to work with our API. Now in the last video we just created our models for our project, and in this video we're going to start on our services. Now I had originally planned on putting both of these services that I'm going to create in the same video, but these are probably the toughest or the longest part anyway of this project of the client application. So I think I'm going to split it up. We're going to work on the data service first, and then we'll go ahead in the next video and create the auth service. So let's go ahead and get started here. So in our services folder here, I'm going to create a new file. And we're going to make this, we're just going to create a new Swift file. And we're just going to call it data service. Alright, now then, this is just going to be a class. It's going to be a class because we're going to make it a singleton. What in the world was that? We're going to make it a data service. Alright. So if you'll remember through some of our other courses, singleton is something that you can use as like a service. There's exactly one object created and it's used throughout your application. And it's static, so you can call it from anywhere. And the way we define it is we say static let instance, and you could call that whatever you wanted to, that's just my preference, equals, and then the name of the class, which is data service. And we go ahead and put the parentheses there. Now when we call this, we can call this from anywhere by referencing just the class name dot instance. So that's how we're going to create our services. So one other thing we're going to do is create a protocol, and we're going to create a delegate protocol. And what that's going to allow us to do is we'll be able to send messages to other classes that conform to this protocol. And we're going to have two functions in here, and we're just going to have one called trucks loaded, and we're going to have another requirement for reviews loaded. Okay, so that's all we need there in this protocol declaration. So once we load the trucks up or the reviews up, we're going to call the delegate method here. We're going to pass that to our delegate, and then anything that conforms to this will get notified and be able to fire off some function or take some action because trucks were loaded. And what that's going to allow us to do is in our main view where we have a table view with all our trucks in it, whenever this gets called, it's going to fire this trucks loaded method. And then over in our main view, we can refresh or reload our table view. So that's why we're having this delegate here. All right, so to start with, we need a weak reference to our delegate. And we're going to have weak var delegate, and it's of type data service delegate. It's optional because we may or may not have anything that conforms to that protocol. So we're going to declare a variable here for food trucks, and that's going to be equal to an empty array of type food truck. And then we're also going to have reviews equal to an empty array of food truck review. And that's what we need there. Now then, moving on, we're going to have some functions in here. And these functions are going to roughly equate to our endpoints in our API. So for the first one, we're going to have a get all food trucks. So we're just going to say func get all food trucks, and it's not going to take any parameters. Okay, and now we're going to use, we could use Alamo Fire or some HTTP helper library, but we're going to go straight up URL session Apple's way of doing it, and we're just going to go for it that way. So we're going to say let session config equal UR session configuration dot default. So that's going to set up our session configuration. Now then, so we're going to create our session and optionally set up a URL session delegate. And we're not going to do that. We're just going to go ahead and set up our create our session. And we need, we're going to choose that one. And our configuration is what we declared up here, session config. Delegate's going to be nil, and delegate queue is nil. All right, so now then, so we're gonna create the request, and we're gonna do a get for /API/v1/food truck. All right, so now then we need a URL. But I'm not going to just hard code URLs in here. I'm going to create a constants file to put our URLs in. So under resources, I'm going to right click here and say new file. And it's going to be a new Swift file. And I'm just going to call it constants.swift. And in our constants file, we're not going to declare a class or struct or anything. We're just going to define some things in here. And the first thing I'm going to define are for callbacks. And so we need it, or I'm going to declare a type alias for callbacks, and I'm going to use in the data service. And if you remember from some of the other courses, we did the exact same thing. So basically we're defining a type alias here that's going to take success as a Boolean. It's going to return nothing. So that's our callback type alias. Now we need a constant for get all food trucks. Actually, we need one for our base URL first. So we're going to have a base URL to start with. So we're going to say let base API URL equal. And that base API URL is going to be the base that we build on for everything else. And it's just going to be equal to http://localhost 3005/API/v1. Now obviously if you're just running on a different port, you need to change this. If you've got it on DigitalOcean with SSL cert, you can put an HTTPS in here and then the right URL. But this is what my setup is currently. All right, so there's our base API URL. Now we need the URL to get all food trucks. So we're going to say let get all FT URL. Now that may seem a little cryptic. That just means get all food trucks URL. And this is just by convention. This is the way I like to do it. I like to define my constants in caps so that I know in fact that is a constant. So for my URL here, it's going to be our base API URL and then a slash and then food truck. So that's our URL for get all food trucks. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. Now we're going to come back here and add some more. But that's where we're going to start. So now then we need to go back to our data service. And we need to deal with our URL here. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to say guard let URL is equal to URL, and it's a string, and we're going to say get all food truck URL. And then we've got to have an else block in here because we are using a guard statement. So if this fails, it's going to immediately return and kick us out of here. All right, so we're going to say var request is equal to URL request, and the URL is the URL. And then we're going to set the request.http method is equal to get. Okay, so we've got that set up. Now we need to create a task. So we're going to say let task equal session.dataTask with URL, but we need a completion handler. So I'm sorry, we don't need a URL. We need a request. So we need to say let task equals session.dataTask with URL request. That's what we need. And then our URL request is our request here. And then for our completion handler, we can say data and data is going to be data. Response is going to be a URL response. And then error is an error. And all these are optional because we may or may not get them. All right, so there's our task. So now we need to say if error is equal to nil. So basically, if our error is equal to nil, we're successful. So we'll say let status code equal response as HTTP URL response dot status code. And I got a typo right there. As HTTP URL response dot status code. Okay. So now then we can print URL session task succeeded. And then we can show our status code. And this is just information in the terminal or the console for us to look at. So then we could say if let data equals data, self.foodtrucks is equal, and this is where we're going to call our static function that we had in our model. So all we've got to do is call the class name, which is food truck, dot parse food truck JSON data. And the data we're going to pass in is the data right here. So we can just say data. And then if we get by there, we can say self.delegate.trucks load, or truck should be trucks. We need to change that. Trucks loaded. All right. Why is this yelling at me? Not sure why that's yelling at me just yet. We're going to go ahead and move on, and we'll come back to it if it doesn't clear up. So if error is not nil, we've got an else block here. So we hit failure. So we can just say print URL session task failed. And then here we can pass in our error. Error.localized description. All right. And then here, we need to close that off. We need to say task.resume. And then we can say session.foodtruck finish task and invalidate. And that's just going to finish our task and then invalidate the session. So it's still yelling at me. We got a typo here. It's if let data equals data. There we go. Now then, that cleared that up. Sorry about that. I knew something had to be wrong there small, but I couldn't figure out what it was. So let's save that and make sure we can build. All right, we're good. So now let's get back to our data service. So now that we're getting all food trucks here. So now we need one to get all reviews for a specific food truck. All right. So actually we can test this out real quick before we move on. Let's come to our main VC here. And let's get rid of all this that we don't need. In our main VC here, we could just say dataservice dot instance dot get all food trucks. Actually, we need to go ahead and conform to our protocol as well. So we're going to do that with an extension here. I like to use extensions just to keep my code separate and clean. So we're going to add an extension to main VC, and it's going to be a data service delegate. And we've got to have exactly 2 functions in here. And that's trucks loaded and reviews loaded. All right, and we're probably not going to use reviews in here, but we've got it in there anyway. So once we get notified that trucks is loaded, we are going to just say print, and then here we'll say data service dot instance dot food trucks. So we'll just print out the array. So when we launch and view did load hits, we're going to load them all up. And then we're conforming to data service delegate. Actually, we're not, because we got to say data service dot instance dot delegate equals self. So now when this starts, this is going to call this get all food trucks. So it's going to hit the database or hit the API and get a list of all the food trucks. Our model is going to parse the data. And then this data service delegate method, trucks loaded, is going to fire off a notification. And when it does, we're just going to print all of our food trucks. So let's give it a run here and just see what we've got. So let's just hit run. All right, so now it's not very pretty, but you can see that we actually have data here. That's mainly what we were looking for. It's not parsed or anything, it's just data. But we can see that we're getting back URL session task succeeded in an HTTP 200 status code. And then we've got this array. And then we've got this array of food trucks here. So we know that we're getting data back. So let's go ahead and move on, and we'll take a look at finishing this up. So I'm going to go ahead and take this print statement back out of here. Let's save that. So let's go back to our data service. So now we need to get all reviews for a specific truck. And I'm going to give us some space here. All right, so this function is just going to be called get all reviews, and then we'll say for truck, and we're going to pass in a food truck. So we're going to pass in the food truck so we can get the ID. So we're going to say let session config equal URL session configuration dot default again. All right, and we'll say let session equal URL session. And we're going to pass in our configuration. And the delegate and the queue are nil. All right, so we got to get our URL again here. So let's go back to our constants. So this one is get all reviews for a specific food truck. So that's going to be our base API URL / food truck / reviews. And then we've got to pass in the ID after this, but we'll do that in code over here. This is our base URL for this. So let me save it and let's go back to our data service. So we need another guard statement here. And it's going to be a string. And that's going to be get all food truck reviews. And then we need a /. And then we need to get our truck up here that we're passing in, this truck right here. Let's say truck.id. And then we need our else statement in here and we'll return otherwise. Okay. So now we need to say var request is equal to URL request. And we're going to pass in the URL. All just like we did above. And we're going to set our request.http method. It's going to be a get request. All right, now we're going to start a task. And we're going to do with URL request. And that's going to be our request. And then our handler all right, so there's that. So we need right here data response and error. All right. So again, we'll say if error is equal to nil, we were successful. So we'll say let status code and then we'll have a print statement here. And we will print our status code. All right. So if we get this far, now we need to parse our JSON data. So we'll say if let data is equal to data, self.reviews is equal to food truck review dot parse review JSON data. And we're going to pass in our data that we've got up here. All right, and then we can say self.delegate .reviews loaded, and that'll fire off our delegate notification there. All right, so we got all that, and then we can skip down here and we can say else, and this is where we hit failure. And we can print our error. All right. And then we need to come down here where we close this off and do task.resume. And then we can say session.finish task and invalidate. All right, so we're moving right along. So that wraps that up. Now we need to add a couple more before we quit. And I'm just going to kind of roll on through these two. And I'll point out differences here where there's differences. These were pretty straightforward. These are GET requests. We're going to add two more. We're going to add one to post a new food truck. And then we're going to add one to post a review. So, to post a new food truck. All right, and before we roll on, I'm going to go ahead and come to my constants file. And then we'll go ahead and put these in here. And then so we're going to have two URLs there. So we've got our base API URL /food truck /add for that one. And then for add a review, we've got our base API URL again /food truck /review /add. All right. So that's the two we're worried about right now. So let's come back over here and let's go ahead and like I said, I'm going to roll on through these. Now for this one, we're going to pass in the properties. And I'm going to add a completion handler here. And if you'll remember in our constants, I defined this type alias here, callback, and that's what we're going to use. So for completion here, I'm just going to put callback. But now in Swift 3, I'm going to have to mark this as escaping. So we have to mark it with escaping because if this closure fires after this function is done, then you have to mark it with escaping. Before Swift 3, that was the default. No escape was, you had to specify that. But now it's changed, and no escape is the default. So on your callbacks, you may very well have to put this escaping decorator there. So that's what we need for the body there, or for the signature. So the first thing we need to do here, and this is a little bit different than we did before, is we need to construct our JSON. So our JSON is going to be a dictionary of type string and any. And so we're going to have name is equal to name, which is what we're passing in here. Food type is equal to food type. Average cost is equal to average cost. Latitude, actually that's just lat. I'm sorry, let me back up here one second. We've got to nest those. So here we've got geometry. And then inside there, we've got coordinates. All right, now we can get to our lat and long. So there's our latitude. And there's our longitude. All right, so This is our JSON. It should look pretty familiar. We've got all our properties here, and it's laid out like the structure of our Mongo database. So now that we've got our JSON constructed, now we need to wrap this up in another do block, a do catch block. And inside our do block, we need to serialize our JSON. So we'll say let JSON data equals try JSON serialization dot data with JSON object. And our JSON object is going to be our JSON we specified here. And options, we're going to do dot pretty printed. And if you look at pretty printed, it just specifies that the data should be generated with white space, designed to make the output more readable. All right, so. And actually this apparently auto-completed. That's just JSON. All right. So there we go. We've got that serialized. Now we need to move on and say let session config equals URL session configuration dot default. And then we need to create our session. And our configuration is our session config. Delegates nil, queue is nil. All right, so there's that. Now we need to create our request. First of all, we need to make sure our URL is good. So we'll guard let URL equal URL string, and that's going to be our post add new truck. Else return. All right. Now we need to create our request. And this is just going to be with URL. So we got URL there. And we'll say request.http method is equal to post. All right. Now then, for post request, if you remember, we've got to pass in that bearer token. And you won't get that until you're logged in. We're going to handle that in the auth service. But at this point, if we don't get that, we need to know, we need to guard that token is there. Otherwise, we need to get out of here and fail, basically. So we're going to say guard let token equal, and we're going to say auth service dot instance dot auth token, and then we're going to all right, let me try to explain this. This right here is going to be a function that we haven't created yet, or it's actually going to be a computed property, and this is going to be in a file called auth service that we're going to create. We haven't created it yet. So basically, this is just guarding that this token exists. Otherwise, we're going to call our completion handler with false, letting the caller know that this failed, and we're going to return to get out of here. So that's where we're at so far. That's good. So now we need to set some headers. And the way we do that is we say request.addValue. And for this first one, you'll remember that the way we pass our authorization token is we have to have the word bearer and then a space and then the token. And the token we got right here. So we assign token this value. So we pass in bearer, a space, and then the token. And then the header field is going to be authorization. Now we need another header for content type. And if you'll remember, using Postman, we set these in the application. And remember, we set application/JSON for the header field content dash type. So there's our two headers that we need. Now then, we need to set our body, our request body. And the way we do that is we say request.http body is equal, and that's just going to be our JSON data that we've got from right up here where we serialized it. So we're passing that serialized JSON into our HTTP body. And now we need to create a task. So we'll say let task equals session dot data task with and it helps if I can type. And that's going to be with request. And then for our completion handler, all right. So we've got data, response, and error, and we're returning void. All right, so we're good there. So now then we can say if error is equal to nil, success. Now I'm going to put another comment here. Check for status code 200. And if it's not 200, then authentication was not successful. If it is 200, we're done. So we don't really need to get back anything here. We just need to know if the response was 200. If the response was 200, we're good. So we're going to say let status code equal response as HTTP URL response dot status code. And then we're going to print URL session task succeeded. And we're going to print our status code. Now these print statements are just for our benefit in the console. So we've got that. And now we'll say if status code is not equal to 200, we're going to say completion is false. And that completion handler is just going to return. We can check this value from where we call it. So we'll say if success, which means if success is true, then we'll continue on. If it's false, we know something went wrong. So we'll say completion is false, and then we'll return. And then we'll do an else here. And we'll say self.getAllFoodTrucks. And what we're doing here is we have added a new food truck. And at this point right here, we've gotten a status code back. And in this else block, it's a 200 status. So that means our food truck has been added. So I'm going to call this getAllFoodTrucks method again here. That's going to grab all the food trucks again. And we'll fire off the delegate method. And then our table view will know that it needs to reload. And we also need to do completion is true. All right. We're getting there. So on this block here, we need to say else. And if we get here, it was a failure. And we'll just print our error out. All right, and then we also need to say completion is false because we failed. And then down here, we need to say task.resume and session.finish task and invalidate. And then down here, if we get this error, we need to call completion handler as well. So the only time the completion handler is going to return true is right here. If we got a status code 200. So that should be good to go for getting or posting a new food truck, All right, so now let's move on. So now we're going to post a new food truck review. And this is going to be very similar, so I'm just going to kind of roll on. All right, so there's our signature. Basically the same, is similar to what we did above. Very similar to what we did above. We're passing, but we do need the food truck ID that we're adding the review for. So we're going to construct our JSON first, just like we did above. And it's a dictionary of type string any. And on this one, we've got a title. We've got a text. And we've got a food truck. And that's just the food truck ID. So that's all the JSON we've got for this one. So now we've got to have our do block. And I'm going to go ahead and put our catch block in here. All right. So there's our do block. So we need to serialize our data first. Data with JSON object. And our JSON object is our JSON. And options is .prettyPrinted. Just like before. All right. Setting our session configuration. And we're going to create our URL session. And our configuration is our session config. Delegates nil, queue is nil. All right. So now then we need to guard our URL again. And if you'll remember, I added that when we added the other one, the last one. So we need to say guard let URL equal URL. We need to construct one from a string. And this is going to be post add new review. But we also need a slash, and then we need our food truck ID here. So if you'll remember, when we add a review, we have to put that food truck ID on the end. And that's how it knows which one to tie it to. And we need our else return here. So we've got our URL. So now we need to create our request. And our URL is just URL. This is a post request again. All right. So now we need to, we've got to deal with that auth token again. So just like we did above, we're guarding that this token gets set from this instance here that we haven't created yet. So now we need to set our headers. And value, we need our bearer token again. And then for header field is authorization. And then we also need our application./JSON for content type. All right, and now we need to we need our JSON body. So we'll say request.http body is equal to our JSON data. All right, and now we're up to our task. So all we've got to do is say let task equal session.data task with request, pass in our request. All right, so there's our task. So now we need to see if our error is nil again. And if it is, we're at a success point here. So we can say let status code equals response as HTTP URL response dot status code. All right, and then we can print URL session task succeeded. All right, so we're going to print our status code. Now we need to go ahead and check for that 200 status like we did in the last one. So we'll say if status code is not equal to 200. So it's not equal to 200 here. We need to return false from our completion handler. Just like we did before, and then return. Otherwise, it is 200. So we need to say completion is true. Now we don't need to call any methods here, because the way our application is set up, you've got to go to a different screen to get to the reviews. So they're going to refresh anyway. So here, we need to say else completion false. And then we need to skip down to here and say task.resume. And then session dot finish task and then validate. Now from our catch block here, we also need to return false. All right. So unless I'm missing something, actually right here, this else, we're going to say this right here is our failure. So we're going to print URL session task failed. And then have our completion, call our completion handler here with false. So I think we're good. It's griping at me because of this auth service we don't have created yet. So we need to move on to create our auth service. And then once we do that, we can try to build it and make sure we don't have any errors. So I know this is getting kind of long. Let's go ahead and jump over to the next video and we'll keep trucking. We'll see you in the next one.